Hello, and welcome to the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting in Malifaux. We have two stories for you today. The first is the story of Leveticus and Alyce, with two surprise guests showing up along the way. We at this station often rely on Leveticus to supply us with some of our more unusual equipment. This equipment allows us to broadcast with the incredible strength and clarity that our listeners know and love. It does not relate in any way to the unusual clanking noises and screams that some listeners report hearing in the background of our show. This story begins with a game, but as all denizens of Malifaux know, a game is never just a game. Remember that the next time you flip a card or move a piece. The result of your decision could determine your fate. I hope you enjoy Upon Reflection.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Captivating Salvage and Logistics. Visit our store in Malifaux for the city's most singular collection of mechanical and occult materials. You're sure to find the perfect component to breathe new life into your creation. And if we don't have it, we'll get it for you. That's a promise.
Upon reflection. Leveticus stroked his chin as he examined the dilemma in front of him. His next move could end him, and he was going to take his time. Finally, he knew what must be done. Check, he announced, placing his rook on the same square as Alyce's bishop. As the piece touched the square, a mechanical buzzing filled the air, and the piece whirred to life. It was a very lifelike, although miniature version of Sebastian, the clumsy guild morgue assistant. The piece raised its sword into the air and brought it down on the head of Alyce's miniature death marshal, cutting it in half. "Rats," Alyce mumbled, wiping the scraps off of the board. "You are too focused," Leveticus said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't see all your options." "Too focused? I've been sitting here looking at these silly pieces with you for hours. I could be out doing target practice." "I'm not talking about your patience. I'm talking about the game itself. You pick a course of action and then see it through to the end, like a dog who has his victim by the throat. It's effective if your opponent lets you do it, but things never stay the same." "What do you mean?" Alyce huffed in annoyance. "With every move, the game changes. When I moved my rook where I did, everything started over. With the move of a single pawn, we are playing an entirely different game on an entirely different board. You have to see it with new eyes and adapt to the changes around you. Does that make sense?" Alyce squinted at the board for a moment before her face broke out into a wide, toothy grin. Her hand whipped out from under the table, bringing her clockwork seeker with it. She squeezed the trigger and the weapon spat out a bullet with a loud crack. Leveticus sighed and shook his head as he gazed down at the giant smoking hole in the middle of the game. "Oh, look," Alyce smirked. "It's an entirely new game, on an entirely new board." The tiny Douglas McMorning, which had been Leveticus's king, fell over with a thump. "And I think that's checkmate," Alyce said with a giggle. There was a knock on the door. Leveticus sighed. "Captivating Salvage and Logistics is closed. Come back tomorrow." There was a pause, and then another knock. Probably some rookie guild guard who still thought gunshots were worth investigating. Leveticus shook his head, cursed under his breath, and then went to open the door. A tall woman with raven black hair stood before him. A wide-brimmed rancher's hat kept the sun off her face, and her long brown leather duster flapped in the wind. For the most part, there was nothing particularly remarkable about her, except for the gaping hole through her chest. "Pardon time," she said, tipping her hat. "Got a bit of business to discuss with you, and I can pay well." Leveticus eyed the woman suspiciously for a moment. The walking dead were nothing new to him, but being hired by them was. Even so, business was business. He gestured for the woman to come in. She smiled and stepped into the room. Alyce came over to greet the visitor, and her eyes went wide. "Whoa, neat. Can I put my arm through it?" Leveticus winced. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair, purposefully ignoring Alyce. "What sort of business did you have in mind?" The woman remained standing. If Alyce had caught her off guard, it didn't show. "I need a man found. His name is Guild Rifleman Hawkins. I heard you would be capable of helping me." "That I am," Leveticus nodded. "Do you have anything of his?" The woman produced a length of cloth and handed it to Leveticus. "I recovered this from a site where he had camped. Once you find him, you'll need to retrieve an item for me. A small black chip of obsidian. You will know it when you see it." Leveticus knew better than to question her further. Finding items he could do. What they were, he didn't much care. "And payment?" The woman smiled and withdrew a pouch from her duster. She opened it, and it was full to the brim with soul stones. The stones had very little opacity, the mark of high quality. Leveticus raised an eyebrow. "I think I will be able to help you." "If not, I have a backup plan. Have the item I seek here by tomorrow night. What happens to Hawkins once you have it is no concern of mine." She tilted her head and winked. "Good luck, hon." "Do you have a name?" Leveticus ventured. "Tara," the woman said, smiling. With that, she spun on her heel and was gone. "Alyce, get the hunter ready. We're leaving now. No sense in staying in. Looks like our game is finished." Alyce grinned and went in the back while Leveticus dissolved the cloth he had been given in a mild acid solution. By the time he was done, Alyce appeared from the back with the hunter trotting after her. The hunter was of guild make. Gleaming metal claws supported a sturdy frame with a feline head and a large harpoon mounted on the back. Hunters were generally used for tracking down criminals by the lawful authorities, but Leveticus thought turnabout was fair play. Leveticus unscrewed a small access point near the thing's snout and poured the solution he'd created in. "There," he smiled. "That should be enough to pick up a scent." The hunter whirred to life and sat up, heading for the door. "The hunt begins!" Alyce shouted with a gleeful smile. Leveticus sighed. Every time. Every damn time." Within a few hours, the hunter had led them out of the city, heading towards the Badlands. As they came over a ridge, the hunter lowered its body to the ground and let out a low mechanical growl. Alyce held up her hand, signaling Leveticus to stop. They were coming up on a low ravine. A ragged tent, which had seen better days, was pitched haphazardly near the entrance to a yawning cave mouth near the bottom of the ravine. The two continued slowly, down towards the campsite, the lonely wind whistling in their ears. Alyce flicked 2 fingers as they approached, signaling him to go right with the hunter while she approached from the other side. She may have been awkward at times, but Leveticus knew better. The woman knew how to handle a situation. As Leveticus approached the campsite, a low groaning sound escaped the cave. The groan turned into a wail, and guardsmen began pouring out of the cave. Their uniforms were ragged and torn, weapons held in broken, twisted hands, flesh rotting from their faces. Undead guardsmen. The hunter reacted immediately, its harpoon impaling the first zombie to come shambling out of the cave before it leapt into the fray. Metallic claws spilled putrid organs on the ground as it opened the corpses up like sacks of flour. Leveticus held out a hand and gathered his will as he began to tap into his power. He could feel the energy being sapped from his body, his bones creaking as he channeled the spell. The closest zombie fell to the ground and then simply crumbled away, silently slipping into oblivion. Many practitioners enjoyed the explosive power that accompanied magic. Leveticus saw no use in that, so long as the job was done. The flap of the tent flung open and a man stepped out. He wore a guild uniform, a rifle slung over his left shoulder. Hawkins, Leveticus guessed. "Obliteration is mine," the man snarled, looking Leveticus in the eye. "He has whispered to me. His power is mine to wield. Mine alone." "Whatever you say, buddy," Alyce said, stepping from the shadows behind Hawkins as she unloaded her clockwork seeker into his back. Her weapon thundered across the valley as Hawkins' body jerked with each shot. But the man did not fall. He turned to Alyce with cold determination in his eyes, blood seeping from his wounds. He held out his right arm, and black obsidian scales suddenly covered the limb, twisting his fingers into claws. He swung the clawed hand at Alyce's head, but she ducked and rolled to the side, firing her last shot into the man's chest as she came to a stop. It didn't faze him. Leveticus held out his hand once more, focusing on Hawkins. This time something stopped him. The clawed arm seemed to be deflecting his power somehow. A groaning heralded the arrival of more zombies. Some continued to spill from the mouth of the cave, others rising out of the sand, chunks of ragged flesh hanging from their decaying bodies. Leveticus gritted his teeth and thought about all those soul stones. Suddenly the air filled with a battle cry, and two women jumped into the fray. They looked like identical twins, but Leveticus knew better. Blonde hair topped their heads, one side shaved. They danced through the zombies, taking limbs as they went. Tara said she had a backup plan. Leveticus grinned. The game had changed. "Victoria!" he shouted. Both women snapped their heads around to look at him at exactly the same time. "Take off that arm and I'll finish him. We'll split the bounty." 60-40, they both said at the exact same time, as the one with two swords lopped the head off of a zombie. Leveticus winced. He hated it when they did that. "Fine, fine," he shouted. "Let's get on with this." The twins smiled, and Victoria grabbed her sister's wrist, flinging her into the horde of undead before jumping in after her. Backs together they twirled, blades flashing in the fading sunlight. Alyce sprinted over to Leveticus. "I thought it was probably best to stay away from the tornado of dismemberment," she panted. Leveticus nodded. The hunter leapt at Hawkins, its jaws open, ready for the kill. But Hawkins simply lifted his clawed hand, and all of a sudden the hunter was gone. There was no explosion, no smoke. The metallic beast had simply disappeared. Leveticus frowned. I can respect power like that. Suddenly the Victoria with one sword leapt out of the mass of mangled zombies. Covered in blood and gore, her face held a frantic grin as her blade arched and fell on Hawkins' shoulder. The man let out a feral shriek as blood sprayed from the wound, and he turned toward Victoria. Leveticus was ready. To say that he unleashed his power would not be entirely accurate. He simply set the world the way it should be. Everything trended towards entropy. and sometimes all that was needed was a little push in the right direction. As Hawkins leapt toward Victoria, his body began to crumble to dust, blowing into the wind. When he was gone, a tiny chip of obsidian fell to the ground. Victoria scooped it up with the flat of her sword, inspecting it before dropping it into a leather pouch. She nodded to Leveticus and casually walked over to her sister to finish off the zombies. Leveticus turned and began walking back to the city. He knew that he would get his share. Mercenaries valued their reputation highly. It was what kept getting them work. The sisters would make good on their end. Alyce followed him, wiping the dust from her clothes. "I don't know how they do it," she mumbled, shaking her head. "That kind of swordsmanship takes practice," Leveticus shrugged. "Oh, not that. I'll stick with a gun, thank you," Alyce said, wrinkling her nose. "Then what?" "Fight wearing those clothes," Alyce said, exasperated. "Do you know how many times something has tried to claw me, or maim me, or gnaw on me, and just gotten a mouthful of hard leather? They're not even completely covered." "Ah," Leveticus said, nodding with comprehension. "And I saw you looking at them," she glared, loading a round into her gun. Leveticus started to chuckle, but his voice stopped short when he saw the look in her eye. There had been enough murder for one day.
For our next story, we have something a little cruder and uglier for your enjoyment. Something for the less refined members of our audience. I am pleased to present Swamp Thang.
Swamp Thang. "So I says, is that so? And bust him in the face," declared Summer Jones. Jones' companions howled with laughter at this witticism, while the jittery locals managed little more than weak titters and mirthless grimaces. Their community was small by gremlin standards, and located in an unenviable patch of marsh, where one divided their day between being bitten by skeeters and getting tangled in the ubiquitous prickle vine undergrowth. Quite why this big-hatted tyrant had descended on their little patch was beyond them, but most had a suspicion that the woman had something to do with it. They knew her as Zoraida, or the Swamp Witch. She traveled through their land regularly, and they had long since realized that she was not to be trifled with, but she had never taken more interest in their affairs than a shark would a school of minnows. Until the day before last, when she marched into their camp with a huge cauldron and clunked it down in the middle of their village. Yellow Joe looked at her humped back and thin limbs, and despite the persistent legends, had come to the conclusion that she was just a frail old crone. He then compounded this poor judgment by trying to see her off with his boomstick. After she threw him in the pot and cooked him, the rest of the village folk decided it would be more prudent to let her get on with her work unmolested. And she was here still, hunched a ways off beside her cauldron, throwing in a twist of this and a sprig of that, giving the mixture inside a periodic stir with a huge wooden spoon carved like a flat-headed snake. Some of the litlins had started bringing her twigs and bits of brush to keep her fire going, and they giggled with delight when she beckoned them to throw the kindling under the cauldron. They never burned the same color twice. Summer Jones glowered at her, resenting the fact that the locals viewed her as some sort of celebrity. He was the one in the top hat. Everyone could see that. He ought to have been in charge. "Wasting my time," he said, taking another swig of shine and wiping his wet mouth. "Got better things to do than hang around this spitball." "All the clans are coming, boss," said Walleye, named for the fact that his bulbous eyes were never pointing in the same direction. Despite this glaring handicap, he was a mean shot with his rusty long-barrel pistol. "You the biggest. Only right you ought to be the first." Summer squinted down at him, not through malice, but rather a difficulty in focusing. There hadn't been much to do under the hot sun other than drink shine all morning. "There's such a thing as dramatic entrance, Walleye," he said, "and this ain't it." "He says it's gonna be important," Walleye continued. "She says? What about I says?" Summer roared. "I got the hat." He was mean drunk, and anyone with a lick of sense would have given him a wide berth. Unfortunately, Walleye wasn't one of them. "Yeah, but," he began. Summer smacked him so hard that Walleye's misaligned vision was momentarily knocked back into alignment. It was a pity that he never had the opportunity to enjoy this stroke of good fortune, on account of being killed stone dead by the same blow that fixed his squint. Jones missed this unexpected side effect, and just like that, the moment was lost forever. The burly gremlin would never know that he had hovered momentarily at life's crossroads. How the path to being Malifaux's first gremlin optician had been within his grasp, but he had unwittingly chosen to remain a crass bully in a big hat. He might have been surprised to know that during his previous misadventures, he had nearly been, among other things, a classical pianist, a seamstress, and 1/3 of a New Age percussion band called We Three Susans. A wooden creaking reached Summer's ears, and he grinned when he caught sight of a big knotwood wagon being dragged into the village. The wagon was piled high with something that had been covered in a canvas sheet, and was being hauled by a huge wooden construct that looked like it was made out of old whiskey barrels. He knew what that meant. "Brewmaster's here," he said, rubbing his hands together. "He's here?" echoed Jethro, trying to see over the throng of green heads. "Really here? He come over the mountain? Let's go say hello, boys." Summer barged his way insolently through the gathering throng of excited gremlins, to see the wizened old alchemist being helped down from the high wagon by a cluster of moon shinobi, carefully setting him down on the swampy ground. The brewmaster wobbled for a moment before his apprentice, Wesley, took his arm and led the icon forward. More shinobi scuttled up and over the wagon. They hauled off the canvas sheet, revealing a huge mountain of barrels lashed together, and the assembled gremlin audience ahed in anticipation. "Hello, Summer, my boy," chuckled the brewmaster when he saw Jones' distinctive form pushing to the front. "How's the home brew coming?" "It's coming well, brewmaster," Summer replied, reverentially dropping to one knee and kissing the old gremlin's withered hand. "I ain't going blind so much as before." "Good, good." The brewmaster waved his hand, and a shinobi appeared at his elbow, holding a wooden cup with perhaps an inch of crystal-clear liquid in it. "Why don't you take a snifter of this, Summer? A little something I've been working on." Summer eagerly took the cup and gulped it down. Instantly his mouth and throat turned to scalding lava, and the world swam out of focus. Hands were slapping his face when he awoke some minutes later, his top hat askew, and drool all down the front of his tunic. The brewmaster was watching him expectantly. It's beautiful," Summer whispered hoarsely, his eyes misting with emotion. "Well, looky here," said Grinner, interrupting the reverie and nodding in the direction of a band of newcomers. "Ain't that a fine sight?" All eyes turned to view a shapely female gremlin approaching. She wore a hat big enough to make Summer adjust his brim defensively, and a pair of impressive shinies in pigskin holsters on her undulating hips. Behind her was a cluster of mean-looking kin, sporting enough boomsticks to make his companions salivate. "Who's that?" asked one of the locals. "That's Ophelia Lacroix," grunted Summer, his post-shine glow fading fast. "Don't you know your betters, boy?" "Well, howdy, Jones," she said as she drew up, resting her hands on those fine-looking pistols, bracketing those fine-looking hips. The bigger gremlin chewed his cigar sullenly, eyes flicking to her wide-brimmed hat. "Thought this meat was just for the big bosses," he said. "So why you here?" she replied promptly. There were snickers from the gang behind her, and Summer's boys stiffened in response to the insult. "Funny," Summer said, bearing his hideous smile. "Only I count you got about a dozen kin with you. I got twice that." "That don't faze me none," Ophelia said, curling a lithe green finger. A stocky gremlin stepped forward, carrying the largest boomstick Summer had ever seen. It was so big he'd had to tie a piglet to the butt just to keep it balanced on his shoulder. He gave Summer a nasty grin. "After all," she continued, "we got twice as many boomsticks." Summer growled. Those LaCroix boys looked like mean hombres sure enough, but he wasn't about to let some young upstart show him up in front of his kin. Before he could throw back another insult, his vision was obscured by a mass of pink. It turned out not to be the shine, but rather the hugest, fattest sow he'd ever set eyes on. The animal rattled and clattered as it labored past, a forest of dented tin pots, pans, and buckets, and two squeaking wooden wheels supporting her titanic belly. From high up on her shoulders, a lantern-jawed goblin was grinning down at him. Across his back was what looked like a circular church organ, only it had a hand grip and trigger instead of a keyboard. "Got any more of that shine, Summer?" he asked. It took Jones a moment or two to place the face, but he handed up the wooden cup with its last dregs of liquid fire just the same. "I remember you now. You was that crazy gremlin who shot all them guild fools dead. Bert Jebson, right?" "That's me." The gremlin tipped the cup in thanks and poured the last drops on his tongue. "Lord's guts, that's mighty powerful stuff." "It's new, from the brewmaster," Summer said, with a hint of pride in his voice. "You must have shot, what, 5 boys with that sumbitch? At the same time, no less." Bert patted the absurd-looking weapon. "My backwater pepper box." Summer chuckled. Any gremlin that killed guild men was kin as far as he was concerned. "And this must be Gracie. She's a big old gal, ain't she?" Bert patted the huge sow's shoulder. "Finest pig I ever owned." "You ought to meet Peaches," he said, hooking a fat thumb over his shoulder. "She's out back eating someone right now, but I'll bring her round later." "When you boys is done comparing your pork," interrupted Ophelia, "maybe we can get this show on the road." "And what the lady wants," cried a shrill voice, "the lady gets." A diminutive gremlin leapt down from Gracie's back, wearing a conical Three Kingdoms hat and an absurdly huge blue robe that would have been too big for the pig. He landed lithely in the mud and performed a deep and formal bow in front of Ophelia. "Oh my, ain't you just the sweetest thing," she giggled, clasping her hands together. "You may call me Wong," he said, fiddling with his long drooping moustache, and what would have been a debonair gesture if one half hadn't come off in his hand. The humid bayou climate did not lend itself to water-based adhesives, and many an ambitious troop had learned the hard way that the first casualty in costume drama was always spirit gum. Summer snorted with laughter. Wong turned in a swirl of muddy silk and launched himself at the huge gremlin. A nasty-looking bladed fan flashed from one voluminous sleeve. Wong shook the metal fold inches from Summer's face like an angry rattlesnake. "Watch your mouth, fat boy," he snarled, "lest you want to feel the wrath of Wong." Summer watched this display with sleepy indifference, blinking slowly. "Hey," he said at length, "somebody go get Peaches. She's hungry." Things would probably have descended into violent anarchy at that point, had Zoraida not appeared in their midst, gripping her lavish wooden ladle like a club.
I swear, she snapped, if you boneheads don't get your skinny green butts over here right this second, I'll turn the whole bunch of you into toads and then hand out mallets to the little uns.
This threat had the desired effect, and after a few more glares and curses, the amassed clans shuffled over to Zoraida's bubbling cauldron.
You know why I called you here, don't you?
She stated when they'd quit their jostling. "'Cause things is changing," Summer said.
That's right.
The Swamp Witch nodded with a grin.
There's a war coming.
"A war?" Ophelia asked.
With who? Oh, you'll find out soon enough. And right now, there's not one of you here got a fool's chance of surviving it. Save me.
"You saying we can't fight?" objected Raphael Lacroix, shouldering his way to the front. Zoraida tutted and cracked him on the head with her spoon, which sent him reeling back into the crowd.
I'm saying, she elaborated, that you have to ask yourselves a question.
There was a bemused silence.
Look at Jones here, Zoraida said,
pointing with her spoon.
A big, mean gremlin if ever there was one.
There were a few chuckles and murmurs of agreement at this.
He's like a thumb, ain't he? Squat and strong like a thumb. What good's a thumb by itself?
There were some scratched heads.
And here we got Ophelia. Slender, dainty little thing that she is. She's cute, like a pinky finger.
Where are you going with... Ow! Summer's complaint was cut off with another crack of Zoraida's wooden spoon.
My point, you toothless buffoon, continued the Swamp Witch, is how much more time are you going to waste being a useless thumb or a dainty pinky? You got fingers all over creation, and not one of them is worth a damn by itself.
The gremlins were still looking nonplussed.
What I'm saying is...
And here Zoraida raised her hand and clenched it.
Wouldn't you rather be a great, big, green, damn fist?
A moment of silence followed, and then 100 pairs of interested eyes narrowed.
You want to win the fight that's coming? You got to unite.
Summer and Ophelia eyed each other warily. I ain't uniting nothing with no Lacroix, he grunted.
Then you're dead,
Zoraida snapped.
Along with everybody else here.
Says you, scoffed the heavy gremlin. It got very quiet. The wind suddenly dropped, and the kin all became aware of a darkening sky and clouds forming in a swirling vortex overhead. Zoraida didn't speak for a moment, but her hands had turned pale from squeezing the carved wooden ladle, and it was clear that she was furious.
Don't you test me, Summerteeth Jones, she said softly.
But her voice carried with it an unnatural resonance.
You of all folk should know not to test me.
Summer swallowed and blustered. But I got the big...
You hold that tongue before I cut it out, she warned. And you know I can do it too. You think losing a few teeth makes you tough? I'll crush every bone you got to powder. And then I'll peel that fat hide of yours, one raw strip at a time, and feed it to your pig. That what you want?
The burly gremlin waited with his eyes lowered, angry and cowed all at the same time.
No, I thought not.
The other gremlins murmured and whispered. They'd never seen Summer spoken to like that before, at least not by anyone that was still living 10 seconds after.
You got a choice,
Zoraida finally said, shaking off the air of menace as the breeze returned and the clouds began to dissolve.
You clans can go out on your own like you've always done, and die on your own. Or you can make a pact, right here, right now, and crush your enemies under the full united weight of the bayou.
She dunked a twisted drinking horn into the bubbling cauldron and brought it up brimming with a thick yellowish fluid. Wordlessly, she held it out. Every army needed a general, right? Summer gave her one last sullen look and drank.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Tune in next time for more Tales of Malifaux.